I had some rather big elaborate plans for the way that this video production would go, but I am a production company of one right now. And the most practical way to make such a video with a production company of one is for one to be close enough to the telephone camera for the audio to be good. And that really is the most important part. So imagine yourself, if you would, in this audio version of the message for March the 22nd in the year 2020 during the social distancing of the coronavirus pandemic that we are observing right now until it's responsible for us to gather together again in public. Imagine yourself standing, if you would, out in the narthex here at St. Martin's Church in Dittmer, looking at that window that's at the end of the hall that has the 4 iterations of this church community in the different buildings that have been standing on this property since the inception of this congregation in 1853. Imagine yourself standing there. Off to your right side is the cabinet that has some historical mementos in it. And I'm thinking about that cabinet today because 167 years ago, during the foment of the Civil War, our ancestors gathered here, half a dozen or so families of German immigrants who were dairy farmers gathered here. They gathered in a building that was a barn, really, served also as a school for the community. They gathered in faith to make their beginning in the Word. And, you know, they faced a lot of adversity. Good times, too, of course, but this was a time when difficulties abounded, and I'm sure that they didn't have as many resources even as we do. And yet, they gave us the church. They passed it on to us in this situation. And so now it is our time. It's our time to remember our past and to think about how we will go forward into the future. You know, these are difficult times, unprecedented difficult times. And I wanted to make a YouTube channel like this for some time. So this difficulty has gotten me to get it done anyway. And I hope that the production, like I said, will improve in future weeks and future times as we gather together like this, so long as we must. To illustrate how difficult the times are, I was standing in the lobby at the post office the other day, and I'm a muddler. You can tell now that my voice is a little bit hoarse. And I'm self-conscious about it. I feel like I should have a sign that says I have allergies when I go in public these days because I cough. And whenever you cough, like I did in the lobby at that post office, there were about 10 or so people there. They all ran for the exits. I can clear a room in pretty short order these days. What I'm really trying to say about our heritage is that those folks who went before us weathered adversity, and so can we, with the help of God, of course. Now I want you to imagine that we're walking down the aisle in the sanctuary, and there the baptismal font stands in the middle. In fact, I think if we were gathering together today, I might be tempted to invite us to renew our baptism today, because I want for the baptismal font, as you picture it in your mind, to represent for us Jacob's well. I want for us to pretend it's Jacob's well. Our lessons for today are from the Gospel of John. We're using the Gospel lessons for 2 Sundays because we didn't meet last Sunday. And we're in that section of the Revised Common Lectionary where we're reading long sections of John's Gospel. So John chapter 4, verses 5 through 42, that's a long citation, is a story of the Samaritan woman whom Jesus meets at the well. That was a lesson for last Sunday when we didn't meet. And John chapter 9, verses 1 through 41, that's the lesson for this Sunday. As I said, March the 22nd, 2020. And while we're looking at that baptismal font in our mind's eye and pretending that it's Jacob's well, I want to note that Jacob's well is a significant site in Scripture. This place was the place where Abraham first and Sarah, before they were Abraham and Sarah, by the way, their names were Abram and Sarai, when God changed their names and made that covenant with them. When they arrived at the place of promise, well, they drew from that well. And when they drew from that well, they also ratified the covenant that God had made with them. The covenant that was theirs because they were faithful to follow where God had asked them to go. And so later on then, Abraham and Sarah's grandson Jacob, now after he had stolen his brother's birthright, now after he had been on the run for his life, now after he had had that marvelous vision of the ladder that stretched from earth to heaven, now after he had wrestled with God and been left with a limp, after he had had 12 sons who became the 12 tribes of Israel, which, by the way, is now his name, Israel, now Jacob stops at this well, and he makes an altar, and he worships and he prays to God. and he ratifies that covenant again that was begun with Abraham before he goes across the river to hopefully be reconciled to his brother Esau, his brother, his twin, whom he was indeed reconciled to. Jacob's well is important also because it's located in the town of Shechem, Shechem, Shechem. You read about it in the 24th chapter of the book of Joshua. There, Joshua, who took over the Exodus journey from Moses and led the people across the river, parted the waters again, by the way, like Moses parted the sea, and led the people over into the promised land. There, Joshua gathered the people together at Shechem, and he said to them, remember how God guided us in the wilderness. He gave them sort of a historical recitation, like I just did about our own place here in Dittmer. Gave them a historical recitation about all the ways that God had been there for them in the past. God had led them in the wilderness. God had given them that manna. God had given them water from the rock. God had given them freedom. And he said to them, now today in this new land you have a choice to make. You must choose who you're going to serve. And as for me and my house, we choose to serve the Lord. Now today then, I think we have a choice to make. Now today we have to choose whom we're going to serve. We're standing at the Jacob's well, and we're listening to the invitation of Jesus then to find living water here, to find water which will satisfy. And we have thirsty souls in these days, in these difficult days. And it's a time for us to remind ourselves during this downtime, this time when we are stuck apart from one another, this time of Lent, when we're encouraged to be introspective. We're encouraged to question the places where we have been drawing water, and if in fact they truly are places that have been satisfying our soul or not. First, I want for us to note that both of the main characters in these gospel stories are outcasts. You might say that Jesus is the main character in the story, and then I'll say, well, he was an outcast too. But the Samaritan woman, she was an outcast because she was Samaritan. The Samaritans were prejudiced against during Christ's time because they didn't worship in the same way as those who went to the temple at Jerusalem. They worshiped differently, and so they weren't to be accepted. There's that. She was a Samaritan woman. She was a woman after all. And there is that. Women in this culture, in this Middle Eastern culture, much the same way as it is today, quite frankly, were second-class citizens. And so then there's also the matter of those 5 husbands. Now, she has been cast as a sinful woman because of that, as a loose woman, if you would. And there's the matter of that one whom Jesus says, the husband you're with now is not your own. That breaks at least one of the commandments, I think. But those other husbands had the right to divorce her, to put her away, and she had no say in the matter, and it left her virtually without any visible means of support, with no livelihood left in the world or in the community, because she may not have given them a male heir. Remember how important that male heir was to Abraham and Sarah, whom we've talked about already, and they finally had Isaac at the promise of God, and before that Ishmael, because Abraham didn't trust in God and had a crisis of faith. And so this woman was an outcast for all of these reasons. For that reason, she has come to the well at the 6th hour in the middle of the day, not when people typically, we might assume, come to the well, because she didn't feel like she was welcome in those social circles. Having noted all that, Jesus approaches her. Jesus breaks all the social convention, and he reaches out to her. He offers her covenant way in much the same way that God offered covenant to Abraham, to Jacob. This is an encouragement to us to think about the way that we form our own relationships. Then there is that blind man in the gospel. He might also be considered an outcast because of this. There's this matter. It's thought that he was blind because of some sin that had been committed by him or in his family. And I want first to note that because that kind of bad theology is still prevalent today. Listen, God is a God of love. The Bible establishes in many places what it says in the Book of Common Prayer. God's property is always to have mercy. And I want for us to remember that in this important time when we might start thinking wacky, weird things about this virus business and why. We won't know an answer to the why. One can only hope that we'll figure out something about the what and how during this time that we have apart from one another, this time that we have when we are soul searching about how to move forward and what the world might look like when this event is all over with. I like to note when we talk about people who have disabilities that often they're people who are extraordinary. Their disability causes them to develop in other ways, and that shows that the human spirit, actually the spirit of God in each human, is something that can overcome. That really is what I want to think about when I think about living water then today when we're at Jacob's Well. Living water is something that feeds our souls no matter what the disadvantage is, something that refreshes us to overcome. I read a story just the other day that there are a new pair of artificial intelligence glasses that have been developed for the blind. And these glasses will recognize the face of their friends when they approach them and tell them who they're talking to. Isn't that cool? And these glasses also will help them when they go into the grocery store to read the barcodes on the items and tell what the price of things are. These glasses will read to them books so that they can read the newspaper. Lord can only hope that it won't help them to drive a car, although all things are possible, right? And I want us to take courage in that. Something else I want to note about the woman at the well. This is March, and it is International Women's Month. And that's an important month to note because women indeed have been considered second-class citizens all across the world. I read a story that in the country of Iran, girls are not allowed to ride bicycles. Can you imagine? That's because it's a theocracy, and it's considered immoral to show any of their flesh in public. And in order to ride a bike, well, I guess they would have to hike up a gown or something like that. But I want you to know that today in Iran, girls are riding bicycles as a matter of protest. And I think it's important for us to stand with them, to support them, and to be with them in that. Living water comes from Christ, who approaches us, who offers us covenant, just like God does, from Christ who ignores all social convention, to remind us, like the Apostle Paul did in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, before that great love chapter in chapter 13. In chapter 12, Paul says, we are like a human body, all of humanity, and we need one another, just like the eyeball needs the nose, and the nose needs the mouth, and the hands need the arms. We are connected in this way. I'm thinking about that poem by Edwin Markham, which is a Civil War era poem at the inception of this congregation way back then. Markham wrote, he drew a circle that shut me out, heretic rebel, a thing to flout. But love and I had the wit to win. We drew a circle that took him in. Those of us who are drinking from living water will find our way clear to be able to reach out to one another, to consider other people different from us as also children of God. I think that this time might be a prophetic time for us to remember our interconnectedness. For goodness sakes, one bug somewhere across the world got across the ocean very quickly and spread to every state of the Union. We are connected. There's no way to deny that in these days. Well, our divisiveness, our dehumanizing of one another into categories is only one example of how we might have been drawing from the wrong well and not drawing from the well of living water. Another one is, remember what was the first thing to go when the virus came to town? It was sports. First, the NBA canceled the rest of the basketball season, and then before you know it, the whole house of cards came down. And I love sports. In fact, I'm supposed to be right now in Jupiter, Florida, at a Cardinals spring training game for the St. Louis Cardinals, and I'm not over it yet. I need a little bit of sympathy, please. I like sports because I like competition. I think it's important. I think it develops character in us. But also, this time can remind us, since sporting events were the first things to go, that life is not a competition. So much of our lives revolve around sporting. I have read that the gambling industry now is taking bets on what the weather's going to be and if the meteorologist is right or wrong because they don't have sports to bet on anymore. My daughter called me the other day and said that her husband, who loves ESPN and likes to watch SportsCenter, was watching a cricket game from Pakistan. And I said to her, "What's the score?" I don't know the rules of cricket. I'm not sure I'm going to learn them anytime soon. But if they're hitting a ball and they're keeping score, I'm somewhat interested. There is a challenge going around the internet that was started by some soccer players. We're excited about soccer in St. Louis because the MLS is going to come here someday. We're building a new stadium. And you know how the soccer players can juggle the ball with their feet. Well, the internet challenge now is a toilet paper challenge, of all things, to keep the toilet paper up off the ground. See if you can do it. I tried it. It's kind of difficult. And did you know, by the way, that there's such a thing as professional tag, T-A-G, the game you played when you were a child? Tag. It's called the World Chase Tag League. It's really quite fun to watch, and you'll see it on ESPN because they've got nothing else to show you these days. You know, the big question that I'm really alluding to here is if we have drawn life from the well of competition, squaring off against one another, keeping score, deciding how well off I am by how well off you're not. This is a time for us to adjust our opinion of where to draw from that well. This is a time for us to look upon one another again as brothers and sisters. The Bible calls us to one another often and in many ways and shapes and forms. You know, I have a t-shirt that I asked my daughter. She has one of those vinyl machines that makes an iron-on. My youngest daughter made it for me, and I plan on wearing it someday to my grandchildren's sporting events. It says on the front of it, I just hope that both teams are having fun. Living water will be drawn from the ability to see that we're all in this life together. This is a graphic statement, I think, of what God's kingdom, God's realm is all about. But there's another thing that I think is important to observe during these difficult days. Does anybody know what the Dow Jones is at this moment? What's the index? How much your stocks are worth? I've been watching it too much and it's making me sick. It's a roller coaster because I'm 62 years old. I just turned that age, and I'm watching my 401k. I know you are. But it's a time for us to ask ourselves if that really is providing any security to us. That, and I mentioned toilet paper earlier. My goodness, that was the first thing to fly off of every shelf in every grocery store from here to Timbuktu. Hoarding has become an issue. I went to the grocery store the other day to pick up a prescription, not any groceries, and the aisles of the grocery store there in Arnold, Missouri, where I live, were jam-packed with carts in a line down every aisle at every cash register, which were open, by the way, because they knew they were going to be crowded. People stocking up on frozen foods and paper products and bleach and hand sanitizer. One woman had a cart full of only wine. And I said to her, "You're my kind of lady, unless, of course, you have a drinking problem, and then I want for us to pray and talk together." The story is like this, that we have placed our trust in the wrong things, in the wrong kind of water. The living water is a water that will give us security by trusting in God. God who has fashioned this creation and has promised not to forsake us. It's a time for us to renew our faith in that God who has a plan, even though we certainly don't have any way of discerning what it is. All we know is it's important for us to trust, and that's where we will be quenched when we look for joy and peace at a time like this. The story which I read that was very uplifting about toilet paper, by the way, was that a firm in Atlanta, Georgia, realized that the 1,000 rolls of paper products and toilet paper especially that they had in their maintenance closet weren't going to be needed. Their employees were all working from home now. And so they put up a sign out on the curb and it said free toilet paper. And anyone who came by and honked their horn and rolled down their window, well, they would toss them a roll of paper into the window, and they gave away their toilet paper that way. I think that's the spirit. That's the spirit that causes us to consider the resources that we have as gifts from God, not to be held onto, but to be given away. Jesus said as much. Those who save their lives will lose them. Those who give their lives, who lose their lives for the sake of the gospel, well then, they will be the ones who will gain their lives. God, give us that living water. God, quench our spirit that way today, so that we can find it in our hearts to reach out and to share at this time, and not to cocoon and to grab and to save and to keep score against one another. The important question that I'm asking today is, which well are you drawing from these days? This question can be answered in a number of different ways. Are you drawing water from the well of your family and your loved ones, from your children or your hobbies or your work? Those are all valid things. But speaking in eternal terms, speaking in soulful, spiritual terms, the only good answer to that question is Jesus, is for us to turn to Christ and to return to Christ. On a deeper level, for Christians, it's the only satisfactory answer. We draw from the deep well of God's love, from the deep well of trusting in providence, and in this manner we're going to find joy and peace and salvation for this time and for every time. Well, that would be all, but there's one more thing. I always like to say that, and it's this. Saw the story just moments ago before I went to begin the taping together today, that a sports writer was trying to start a Twitter challenge. And I don't do Twitter, maybe you do, but he was encouraging people to put their Christmas lights back up, to get them out of the attic or wherever you've got them stored and put them back up. And in this fashion, he said, we could get in our cars and we can drive up and down the streets of our neighborhoods. And that way we can maintain social distance, but we can still spread some light and spread some joy. Then there was another gentleman, I think his name was Mark Griffin, who tweeted that his 10-year-old son said, Daddy, could we put the Christmas tree back up and put the lights on the tree? And so he said, I put the tree back up to show the light and the spirit of my loving 10-year-old, and to say that we ought to all be more like him. Of course, now, a 10-year-old, if there's a Christmas tree up, is going to be expecting a Christmas present. So there's that to think about. God call us to be able to find a spirit of joy, even at a time like this, because we have drawn from the deep well that makes us patient and peaceful and kind and loving and just, in good days and in bad days, because we know that all days are wrought in God's grace. God bless you, and let's meet together soon, just as soon as we can. In Jesus' name, amen.